Did you know there's a direct correlation between how burned out your adrenals are and how damaged your gut lining is? Hi, I'm Jordan Reasoner, and today I'm going to share a clip from a recent interview I did with one of my mentors, Dr. Dan Kalish, one of the world's best functional medicine practitioners, where he shares the direct relationship between our gut and our hormones. So if you've ever struggled with low energy, chronic fatigue, and hormone problems like PMS or low testosterone, you won't want to miss this interview with Dr. Kalish. Let's listen in.
Yeah, in the earlier stages, when you're first having adrenal burnout and the cortisol levels are up, you may not yet have developed the GI symptoms. Sometimes it takes a few years of stress before the GI stuff starts to show up.
And do you find that it's pretty common for you to find somebody that's, like you said, you might see that they're in stage 3 adrenal fatigue, and then you're also correspondingly finding a lot of GI infections together as well?
Every stage 3 I've ever seen, if you're that burned out, and for the audience, if you don't know, stage 3 is like the last stage, so that's the extra bad stage of adrenal burnout. Every stage 3 I've ever seen has got a gut problem. I don't think you can be a stage 3 without a gut problem.
Wow, that's really
what I mean by that. They're so intimately tied together. At around the 20-year mark, together, they're the same thing. So every adrenal stage 3 has some level of gut problem. Every really severe gut case has a stage 2 or stage 3 adrenal burnout with it. It's impossible to separate them. And there's one other connection, right? Because we talked a little bit about how when you're stressed, your cortisol goes up and then your Sig-A drops, so your gut becomes a target. But then it works the other way as well, which is equally bad, which is that if you're doing something to inflame your gut, let's say you're doing something kind of fun, like eating sugar or drinking alcohol, right? If you're doing something that's going to inflame your gut, what's that going to do? It's going to drive cortisol up, because cortisol is an anti-inflammatory hormone. So the more abuse your gut suffers, the more inflamed your gut becomes from bad lifestyle choices, diet sodas, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, whatever it is that you're doing that's inflaming your gut is going to drive your cortisol up, and then that's going to further weaken your gut immunity and make an even bigger problem. So damage to the gut makes the adrenals worse. Damage to the adrenals makes the gut worse. Those two things are linked.
Yeah, it's like a vicious cycle, and I think that's why the word connection is important, because the relationship does go both ways. It's not the hormones just affect the gut or the gut just affects the hormones. And I think it ties back to earlier when you answered the question, well, how do we have hormonal crashes? How does our hormonal system crash in the first place? And you talked about this conglomerate of different triggers of chronic stress. And yes, we all know about emotional stress. We all know about stressful jobs and emotional relationships, or losing a spouse, or losing a child or a parent. But the physical stressors, like you talked about from diet, can be just as equally powerful as losing a child or losing a parent, for example. If you're eating gluten every day and you're gluten sensitive, the damage to the gut can be just as stressful. Is that correct?
Yeah, because this is a really interesting thing, is that these systems don't discriminate regarding the original source of the stress. So like if you're gluten sensitive and you're eating gluten every day, that's going to cause inflammation and high cortisol just as much as if your mother-in-law lives next door and you hate her and she yells at you every morning, right? It doesn't matter if it's emotional or dietary stress. They both do the exact same thing in the exact same way. They drive cortisol up, and then the gut immunity drops. Boom, boom, just like that. And
then if you have both, the mother-in-law and the gluten, it's double extra bad, right?
Let's say the mother-in-law is Italian and she forces you to eat pasta every night that she made, then you're really just like, and then you're going to have to get divorced, and then you're going to have even more stress. So, I mean, we shouldn't be laughing. It's not funny, but it gets to the point where you're just thinking, how am I going to get out of this, right? And so it's not as hard as it sounds to get out of it. Once you understand how you got there, the way out starts to become really obvious. And I think if you don't understand what led to the hormone crash or the gut problem, then it's all really murky. And that's why I like to do these kinds of talks, because I think it really empowers people. If they can listen to what we're saying and go, "Why, that sounds just like me or my best friend," then all of a sudden you realize that there's a potential solution to this, because you understand exactly where it's all coming from.
So I want to take a step back. We've been talking, kind of throwing some things around like a stage 1 adrenal fatigue or stage 3 adrenal fatigue, and we've been kind of tossing these things around. And you've talked about, bad stuff happens when cortisol is really high, and bad stuff happens when cortisol is really low. And I think that's one of the most common things that we see with people with, inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and IBS, and people who are very, very sick that have come to SC lifestyle. Those people primarily, probably 95%, have extremely low cortisol levels. But it's a process that happens where it starts high and then it goes low. So I think it would be a good time now to just give us a quick overview of what are the 3 stages of adrenal fatigue, what's happening to our cortisol. Talk us through that process.
Yeah, so there was a scientist named Hans Selye who wrote about this many, many decades ago. And what he did was rather unfortunate, but he took rats or mice, I forget which one, and he kind of tortured them and made them feel like they were about to drown constantly, but he didn't kill them. And it would probably be hard to do these kind of experiments now because we don't feel like torturing animals is appropriate anymore. But anyways, it's an interesting series of experiments. And what he does is he then killed them after he tortured them, and he measured their adrenal glands and what was happening. And what he put together was that there's an initial phase of the stress response that we go through, just like a rat or a mouse would, where we're first under stress and cortisol levels shoot up. But if you keep a person or a rat in a situation where they feel like the stress is going on year after year after year, the adrenal glands start to fade and cortisol production starts to drop. It'll drop lower and lower and lower the more exhausted that the adrenal glands become. And so the popular conception of adrenal stress is that we must have high cortisol. And when people see low cortisol in their labs, sometimes they're kind of happy. They're like, oh, at least it's not high. But in fact, in general, a stage 1 meaning high cortisol, a stage 2 meaning cortisol is dropping, and then a stage 3 meaning cortisol is very low. The lower that the cortisol is going, the more burned out the person is, the harder it is to repair, the more gut problems they have. And, there's a study that came out a few years ago. It was really kind of funny to me when I heard the report on it, because they were measuring executives, high-level executives, and saying that high-level executives had really low cortisol in comparison to people basically who don't have as much money, and how being a high-level executive running a huge company is less stressful than someone who's like in a middle management job. What they didn't realize is that by the time you get to be a senior VP or a CEO of a big company, your adrenals are so burned out you can't make that high cortisol anymore, right? When people are stressed for year after year after year and they have that go, go, go personality, the cortisol levels start to burn out. And eventually the fat and the fatigue and the depression and the low sex drive problems kick in.